Chrono Trigger, the classic RPG released by Squaresoft in 1995, is a game that I come back to a lot. Back in 2012, I wrote an entire book about Chrono Trigger as a part of the Reverse Design series. You can find a link to that book in the video description below. At the time, I thought I had said everything that I could say about the game. For a variety of reasons, I was wrong. And to remedy that fact, I'm going to be making a new version of that book. You can find out more about the new version at the end of this video, but let's jump into the problem at hand. My biggest oversight was that I didn't notice the game performs two incredible structural tricks, not just one. I want to start by explaining what I mean when I say structural. Structure, at least for the purposes of this video, is how the story of Chrono Trigger is told. I'm always a little reluctant to compare video games to television and movies, but I think doing so will help me talk about structural advantages and disadvantages in storytelling of all kinds. Some stories are easier to tell because of the way they're set up. The indie thriller Circle relies on a central timing mechanism to drive its plot. Every 2 minutes, one of the characters dies, and all of the drama arises out of that fact. The X-Files is driven by the structure of the FBI. Mulder and Scully are FBI agents. That explains why and how they can do what they do. But the nature of their many cases also explains why the show can be divided up episodically. The decision to make them FBI investigators lifts many of the storytelling burdens off the shoulders of the writer of any given episode. The structure I want to look at, though, is the one in the TV show Lost. There were a couple of good reasons why Lost was able to do things which were unusual for broadcast television at the time. I don't think Lost is the greatest show ever, it has some serious flaws, but Lost makes for great comparison to Chrono Trigger because of its structure. The first thing that Lost had going for it is that it told a linear, ongoing story. Back in the early 2000s, this was pretty rare for a network television show, but it's the second structural advantage that's really important. In Lost, most episodes are telling two main stories. The first story takes place in the present and is set on a mysterious island. The second story takes place in the past of one of the characters, explaining how they got to the island and how they became the person they currently are. This structure of telling two stories gives the writers of Lost a lot of leeway. If they're having trouble with thinking of mysterious things to happen on the island, they can lean heavily on the featured character's backstory, or vice versa. They can also, in a sense, warp time. What I mean by this is that when the writer starts two story threads, in the minds of the audience, both stories will continue toward their respective climaxes even when we are not watching them. For example, in the episode Deus Ex Machina, we see the events of a day or two play out on the island, but we see the events of several months play out in John Locke's past. The episode cuts between these two storylines more or less equally, but a lot more time passes in John Locke's backstory. And yet, we accept this asymmetrical passage of time for three reasons. First, because we're so caught up in the rapid pace of the two stories, we don't have a chance to notice the difference. Second, the two storylines are thematically connected. Locke suffers two bitter personal defeats, years apart, but the audience sees them happen within a few minutes of one another. The juxtaposition of those two events doesn't make sense in terms of time, but it makes sense thematically. Third, and probably most important, this technique is just as convenient for the viewer as it is for the screenwriter. We don't need to see the boring things that happen in between important events. It's much nicer if we can just assume that while we watch one storyline, the other one is still moving toward its climax in the background. Let's switch over to Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger's characters don't really hold up to the people we meet in Lost, but Chrono Trigger is every bit Lost's structural equal. This assumes that you can make direct comparisons between two types of media, which I said that I'm not actually comfortable doing, but let's move on. Chrono Trigger does two really bold structural things. As I said earlier, I wrote a whole book about Chrono Trigger's design, with special focus on its quest structure, back in 2012. That book goes into a lot of detail about one of those structural tricks. The thesis of my book was that Chrono Trigger is really two different games. The first 13 quests, culminating in the confrontation with Lavos at the bottom of the Ocean Palace, form a complete game, what I call the Tragedy of the Entity. The open-ended quests, which start at Death Peak, form another game, which I call the Comedy of the Sages. The divisions between the two games of Chrono Trigger are significant in many ways. For one thing, the Tragedy of the Entity is almost entirely linear. The party is led through 13 scenarios over which they actually have very little control. It's not obvious at first, but the player has virtually no impact on history during these quests, despite their ability to travel through time. In the first quest, The party saves Queen Lean from Yakra, but as Lucca points out in that quest, this is something that Frog would have done with or without Chrono's appearance. In prehistory, Chrono helps Isla defeat Azala and the Reptites, but this victory is pointless because Lavos would have fallen out of the sky and buried the Tyranno lair regardless. In the Middle Ages, the party defeats Magus, but remember that the Millennial Fair is an event commemorating Magus's defeat, so either Frog or Lavos must have defeated Magus long before Chrono ever meddled with time. Then, finally, the player's party attends the destruction of the Kingdom of Zeal, but the only effect they seem to have is in raising the Black Omen from the bottom of the sea. The rest of the kingdom's history is exactly the same. Meanwhile, Chrono dies, completing his journey as a tragic hero, a character whose only attribute is that he's the protagonist called by fate to fight an overpowering monster. Robo later reflects on this during the campfire scene, explaining that the planet was essentially giving them a guided tour of its own sad history, and the many terrible events precipitated by Lavos. Starting at Death Peak, however, a new game begins. The nice thing about being a tragic hero in a game about time travel is that your friends can go and save you from your fate. Then, assisted by a flying time machine, the party gets to cruise through time and space, doing quests in any order, and actually achieving significant changes in history. This second game of Chrono Trigger plays differently than the first half, tells a much more personal story, and has a much happier climax and resolution. But everything I've just said about Chrono Trigger is stuff I covered in the book 5 years ago. If that interests you, the book goes into a lot more detail. But as part of a Kickstarter I'm currently running, one of the rewards I'm offering is a greatly expanded version of that text. Because even after writing a whole book, there's still more to say about Chrono Trigger, and a couple of other games too. The big thing I missed is the way that Chrono Trigger uses a second structural trick on top of its two-game strategy. The second structure is similar to the way that most episodes of Lost are written. Although Chrono Trigger does it in a different way, it also uses multiple storylines and the same asymmetrical passage of time. When Chrono and company leave an era, the timeline in that era continues moving towards its climax, even when the player isn't there to see it. Let's take the first quest and its aftermath as an example. In any other game, after Chrono and Frog save Queen Lean, the player would probably be forced into a filler quest, like finding the materials to rebuild Xenon Bridge, or something equally banal. Not in Chrono Trigger though. Instead, Chrono and company go through a trial and daring escape, go on an adventure through a post-apocalyptic future, and then fight monsters in a magic cave. Here's where the asymmetric passage of time comes in. The trial and imprisonment take 3 days maximum. The journey through the future takes between 1 and 3 days. The party never sleeps at an inn because there are only Enertons, which only require a few moments to use. The journey through the Hecarim cave takes 1 day. So a week has passed at most. And yet, when the player returns to 600 AD, it seems like a lot more time has passed in that era. Since the party has left, Xenon Bridge has been repaired, the king has fought a battle on it and been wounded and been evacuated, and the knights stationed at the bridge have been encamped there long enough that they've run out of supplies. Seems like more than a week, doesn't it? Naturally, Chrono Trigger gets away with this for many of the same reasons that Lost gets away with it. It's convenient, and it leaves out the boring parts. But in its best moments, this technique is used to pair up different events in the plot in meaningful ways. A few people have remarked that Chrono Trigger is a series of climaxes. I don't think that's exactly true of the whole game, but the designers definitely cultivate that impression. There are 5 time periods, each with its own plotline, and 6 mandatory characters. From a structural perspective, each time period has a storyline climax, and each character has a personal climax, the end of their character arc. If you're counting, that means there are 11 possible climactic moments, although a few of them happen at the same time. But that fact alone gives the story a lot of high points, so let's take a look at how those play out. The first real climactic moment in the game happens in 600 AD, but it's the quest before it that sets up the structural tricks that are about to happen. Quest 7 introduces Isla and the 65 million BC era. The party collects Dreamstone to repair the Masamune. Then, in Quest 8, they return to the Middle Ages to fight Magus, which concludes the main storyline of 600 AD. But just after this, in Quest 9, the party is immediately thrown back into another climactic event in the 65 million BC era. Isla's confrontation with Azala and Lavos' crash landing onto the planet serve as the climax for the prehistoric era and Isla's personal storyline. But we were only introduced to Isla and the prehistoric era 1 quest ago. Why do players accept such a quick resolution to her quest and her era? It's probably for the same reason that we accept the uneven timelines of Lost episodes. The quest through Maga's castle is long, important, and climactic. Because of everything that happens there, the player is able to accept that a sufficient amount of time has passed between Isla's introduction and the climax of her story. Both storylines continue on towards their climax even while we're not watching them. And, just as in Lost, the two interwoven stories are thematically connected. They both end with the sudden appearance of Lavos and the revelation that everything the party thought they knew about Lavos is wrong. So we do have two climaxes in back-to-back quests there. But this is where the thesis that the game is a series of climaxes gets a little murkier. The next two quests aren't really climactic at all. Indeed, Quest 10, which takes the party on their first trip through the Kingdom of Zeal, is remarkable for what an incredible change of pace it is. There's no clear goal. There's no dungeon. There's not even a lot of obligatory dialogue. It's one of the most brilliant and unusual quests in any RPG ever. In my book, I spend more time and words looking at that quest than any other. So if you really want to go down the rabbit hole about the Kingdom of Zeal, check it out in the links below this video. But let's zoom out for a second. After the two climaxes in Quest 8 and 9, we have a quest which introduces us to the new time period at a very low level of tension. Then, another quest on Mount Woe starts to dial the tension up again. Then in Quest 12, the Kingdom of Zeal storyline and Chrono's character arc reach their respective climaxes. Then there are another two quests of lower tension in the Blackbird and at Death Peak. Then we get to the part of the game that could most fairly be termed the chain of climaxes. In the second game, the Comedy of the Sages, the player can go through the climax of Lucca's character arc, Robo's character arc, Marl's character arc, and Frog's character arc in rapid succession. This isn't the first time that a Squaresoft game has used this trick for character arcs. The second half of Final Fantasy VI also gave the player a bunch of quests which complete various character arcs, and that part of the game also proceeds in a non-linear way. The real difference is that in Chrono Trigger, the game gives every party member a meaningful climax, and those climaxes are grouped more densely. Not every character in Final Fantasy VI gets a full character arc, but on the other hand, some of their stories take multiple quests to play out. That's all intentional. Final Fantasy VI was supposed to be a massive game, but one of the intrinsic structural advantages of Chrono Trigger is that by telling a slightly shorter story, the game can push all of its climactic moments closer together so that it feels like the high points arrive one after another. That's a big reason why Chrono Trigger feels so tightly plotted. The plot never stalls out on any filler quests. The party can just jump over to whichever timeline is about to reach its climax. This video is just a small excerpt from a much larger project called the Reverse Design series. That series was a product of a Kickstarter that I did back in early 2012. Right now, I have another Kickstarter going to support the creation of 4 new books in the same series. The expanded Chrono Trigger book that this video previews is one of the backer-exclusive rewards that you can get for becoming a contributor to that campaign. Because the books take months or even years to produce, and because they require resources up front, funding platforms like Patreon are not a good means of supporting them. But if you're interested in getting a whole bunch of backer-exclusive books and in supporting serious research into game design, you can click through to the campaign via the link in the video description below. And I thank you for your support.